Hi, my name is Woody Holton. I'm from over in the history department, and my main duty today is to tell you to turn your damn cell phone off, please. Thank you for, Pauline's going to turn hers off, good. But I'll also briefly introduce Pauline Maier, who I'm thrilled to join you in welcoming Pauline Maier back again to the University of Richmond. Some of you may not know that she was here just 2 years ago, right when this book was about to come out. And I have to admit, I had a little skepticism when I saw in the email that my friends across on this side of Stern Quadrangle were invited. I'm not sure you're going to get a crowd. And of course, here you are packed in. My skepticism was completely unjustified once again. So Pauline Maier is a product of this workshop that Bernard Bailyn created. He's sort of the Geppetto of this creature that we have blessing us here today at Harvard about 40 years ago. Of course, she's one of the later graduates of this graduate seminar that Bailyn established. And what I like about these brilliant people that came out of that Bernard Bailyn grad class is that they've kept to his standards of research and originality and very precise prose, but some of them have wandered off the reservation. And I'm pleased to say that Pauline Maier is one of those, as you will see today. And this reminds me, actually, that it shows what a great workshop it is, because it also produced our speaker for next week that not everybody's known about, and I'm going to take this opportunity to plug your friend Peter Wood is coming week. So come back, Pauline, for Peter's talk about an illustrated lecture. Did you bring slides? He did next week on Wednesday to talk about Winslow Homer's portraits. Do you mind if I pass that around? So you can know about one of her colleagues from that PhD group at Harvard. So she wandered off the reservation intellectually in wonderful ways, but not very far geographically. She is the William Kenan Professor of American History at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Despite teaching at our premier techie institution, anybody here who has read any words of hers knows what an amazing writer she is. And I was just noticing as I was going through my bookshelf this afternoon that I've read every one of her books. I'll just hold up some of them. I won't tell you the titles of them. Yeah, this one went on canoe trip. And so I've read all of her books, which is something I can't say of even other famous historians of this American Revolutionary era, many of whom have only written one book. But I have read all of hers. And let's just mention the last couple of them. Among many other insights in the book she's not talking about today, American Scripture, was that before Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, 90 other declarations of independence had already been written. Resolves and petitions, instructions to delegates, just to give you a little taste of the kind of original insight you'll find from Pauline Maier. And then finally, the book, which is the topic for today, Pauline Maier's Ratification won the George Washington Book Prize, which is a great honor and a medal. You go, they always have, which Supreme Court justice did they have when you were there? They always have some yeah. So there's always a Supreme Court justice there to hear you give your grand lecture. And it's a $50,000 prize. So after the talk today, Pauline will be taking us all out for drinks. But let's introduce Pauline Maier. Thank you, Pauline.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be back at the University of Richmond. It's always fun when Woody's in the room. I remember, actually, I don't know if you remember, the first time we met, we had a very memorable conversation because he said to me something nobody had ever said to me about my scholarship. He said, "Your footnotes." And I said, "Yes." He said, "You say who a letter was from and to, where the date was?" I said, "Yes." He says, "Not many people do that." He said, "I like it." I thought, there we go. I mean, you have to know about these documents or you can't evaluate them. I mean, so I could tell, although we may have some differences intellectually, we agree on footnotes. And I'm going to start the talk. The topic, which I believe was announced, is the ratification of the United States Constitution, the book, and why we should care. And I'm going to start with an executive summary of the story, just so we're all on the same page. On September 17th, 1787, the Federal Convention adjourned and presented the people of the United States with a gift they weren't expecting, a new Constitution. The convention asked that its proposal be laid before Congress and then submitted to specially elected popular conventions in each of the states for their assent and ratification. When 9 state conventions had voted to ratify, the Constitution would go into effect over those states, giving substance to the document's opening words, "We, the people of the United States, ... do ordain and establish this Constitution." 12 states called conventions during the next year, all but Rhode Island, which decided instead it would have a referendum and then voted the Constitution down 2,708 to 237. That's about a little 11 to 1 against. Now, 11 conventions, however, had met during the next year and ratified, voted to accept the Constitution before 13th, 1788, when the Confederation Congress officially declared it ratified and made arrangements for the first federal elections. Okay, that short version of the ratification story, except perhaps for the bit about Rhode Island, sounds tame. I assure you it was not. I am particularly fond of a description by a reviewer in the December 12 issue of Esquire, which incidentally said that mine was among the best books of the year. Never mind, it was December 2011. Never mind that it had been published in 2010. The paperback came out in 2011. At any rate, the reviewer said the ratification fight was a fist fight, a bare-knuckled political brawl, and indeed one of the greatest political brawls of all time. And it was also so important, as James Madison put it, the voice of the people speaking through the state conventions breathed life and vitality into what had been only the draft of a plan, nothing but a dead letter. In that sense, the ratification process was a bridge between our feeble national origins in the 1780s and everything the United States became thereafter. Okay, that leads to what seems to me a pretty obvious question. Why is my book the first comprehensive narrative history of ratification? We have shelves of books on the Federal Convention that wrote the Constitution, and some of those books have a final chapter or maybe an appendix in which they summarize the bare-bones story of how the states voted and in what order, as if to tie up loose strings. And I think that very format gives us a clue for answering my question. It suggests that the real story, the real drama, was in the writing of the Constitution between May and September 1787. Ratification, by contrast, was a no-brainer. I would, after all, be a peculiarly lunk-headed nation that failed to accept the gift of a miracle at Philadelphia, as Catherine Drinker Bowen entitled her 1966 book on the Federal Convention, or to give the title of a more recent one, The Decision at Philadelphia. The decision was made by September 17, 1787, and everything was followed, as we don't like to say at MIT, engineering. We think of engineering as a bit more innovative than the common term would suggest. But could ratification have been so untroubled? And consider, I asked you, a few inconvenient truths. First of all, the Federal Convention had no authority to write a constitution. It had been called by Congress for the sole and exclusive purpose of proposing changes to the Articles of Confederation that would make them sufficient to serve the needs of the Union. To be sure, the convention later explained that it couldn't give more power to the Confederation because all that power would be exercised by the Congress, and that it was, since it was the only branch of government under the Confederation. The convention therefore had to redesign the central government before empowering it, so its powers would be exercised and divided among legislative, executive, and judicial branches. Nonetheless, for the moment, the only political agency that had exceeded its official powers was the Federal Convention. And in a country leery of abuses of power, that would not go unnoticed. Second, to add to its sins, the form of ratification the Federal Convention specified was different than that for amendments to the Articles of Confederation, which required the consent of Congress and of all 13 state legislatures. Instead, the Constitution was to be laid before Congress, whatever that meant, and the Congress itself was a little baffled by it. What it clearly meant is that its assent was not required, and then it was to be accepted, ratified and accepted, and I suppose by logic rejected, if they so chose, by elected conventions in only 9 states before it went into effect. What about the other 4? Was the United States, whose unity had been hard won during the independence movement, to become the disunited States with a set of small independent countries along its borders? Finally, the convention said, and although I have to say it had no more authority to say this than to design an entirely new form of government or to specify how that new government would be enacted, the state conventions could make no changes in the Constitution. They had to take it as written by its unauthorized authors or reject it entirely. That was too much for 3 delegates who had sat through the convention and taken an active role in its work. George Mason, a Virginia delegate who was arguably the country's most distinguished constitutionalist, pointed out that the convention had met in secret, that it had no feedback whatever from the people, and that a constitution had to fit the needs and the wishes of the people. He also said it wasn't nice to tell the sovereign people, take this or nothing. He refused to sign. So did his colleague, the Virginia governor, Edmund Randolph, an ardent advocate of constitutional change who had introduced the Virginia Plan. He said this up or down strategy was surely going to lead to the rejection of the Constitution. And Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts just joined the 2 Virginians. 3 of them lasted to the end of the convention and then refused to sign. There were others who were not happy with what the convention did, and they sort of filtered out in the course of its meetings. They had disappeared by the time the convention came to its final days. Now, if the convention was divided, you can bet the country would be. Indeed, the miracle at Philadelphia syndrome built upon a reverence for the Constitution that set in with surprising rapidity once it had been ratified, but was conspicuously absent in the year before, a year racked with controversy and excitement. With commentary on the Constitution and information on what was going on in other states, one observer claimed that in New England, the newspapers were in that fraught year read more than the Bible, which is saying a lot in New England. Massachusetts, the towns not only elected delegates, but discussed the Constitution with some thoroughness. The little town of Richmond in western Massachusetts, which I'm tempted to call your little sister city, had no less than 4 informational meetings before the residents decided that the Constitution was no good as it now stands, that is, without amendments. In Virginia, Madison also commented that the electorate was more assertive than he had experienced in the past. It insisted that the delegates represent their views on the Constitution. And all of this excitement seems to have drawn in people who were not a part of what Henry Adams once called the political people, that is, those who were qualified to vote and to hold office. We do know, my guess is that women were very much involved in this, but often in places where their words were not recorded. We do have one account of a rip-roaring argument over the Constitution in, of all places, a home in Biddeford, Maine. And it did not seem to me insignificant that 3 of the 4 participants, including the protagonist, were women. Moreover, when the conventions met, one after another faced the same problem: how to find a hall big enough to accommodate not only the elected delegates, that wasn't a problem, they had legislative halls, but the crowds of people who wanted to witness the debates. Sometimes the ratification process literally became a brawl, such as when Federalist mobs, and I have to say that's a phenomenon I don't recall reading much about before. Do you? Even no. There are a lot of Federalist mobs in my book. What did they do? Well, they attacked or harassed critics of the Constitution in Philadelphia and New York, forcefully closed down an election in North Carolina when it seemed to be going against them, and went head-on, head-to-head, in Albany, New York, with anti-federalists who had celebrated the 4th of July by ceremonially burning a copy of the Constitution, which for them threatened everything they had fought for in the Revolutionary War. They also, I have to say, ceremonially burned news that Virginia had ratified. They weren't really happy about that. Why all this passion? Why all this excitement? Because it was not clear whether the Constitution would save the country or spell its ruin, whether it would fulfill the revolution, as people like Washington ardently believe, or as many others thought, undermined everything the Americans had fought and died for. So long as that was true, ratification could not have been a no-brainer whose outcome was obvious. Okay, then back to my question. If the story is so exciting, why did nobody write my book a long time ago? And I suspect that the answer is that the documentary record on ratification, unlike that on the Federal Convention, is huge and widely scattered in both central archives and local libraries throughout the original 13 states and other parts of the Republic. You know, they tend to wander, these documents, to collectors here and there. It might well take more than a single professional life to collect them all and write a comprehensive history, and I am unaware that God is accepting applications from historians for second lives because they had failed to finish a book. It'd be kind of nice, but I don't think it's going to happen. So historians have, seen the handwriting on the wall. We're all very realistic, and they did what we're trained to do in this case: explore a workable part of the topic, such as ratification in a single state or some part of the polemical literature. Alternatively, they have written on the whole story with limited questions in mind, which of course constrains the number of documents you need to consult. Or they work together. I mean, there are a couple of books which we can describe as works of collaboration, where different historians or political scientists wrote essays on each of the ratification in each of the states. The trouble there is that the drama, the way one influenced the other, kind of disappears in the cracks between chapters. So there's no real thrust to the story. A lot of it is just missing. And then there's another problem. I think writing about the state conventions posed a special difficulty because, as James H. Hudson, head of the Library of Congress's manuscript division, said in the 1986 Texas Law Review, the records are flawed. In several states, the debates of the state conventions were not even recorded, which makes it rather difficult to describe what was said, at least in any detail. And where the debates recorded and published, the results reflect the limited skill of the so-called shorthand man who took them down. Few had put in the requisite 8 years to master the relatively new skill of stenography, and they missed not just lines or paragraphs, but whole speeches and occasionally entire days. They also sometimes let speakers make changes in the transcripts of their speeches before they were printed, which corrupted the record. Finally, the printed debates were biased toward the Federalists, who often paid the stenographers who recorded them, owned the newspapers in which they were first printed, and subsidized their publication in book form. They did that as a way of giving Federalists in other states arguments they could use to get the Constitution ratified. Needless to say, that means Federalists had little incentive to publicize the arguments of those who questioned the Constitution. The results are conspicuously clear in the published records of the Pennsylvania Ratifying Convention, which reproduced the speeches of only 2 leading Federalists. You would think they were arguing with ghosts, except one of the critics of the Constitution interrupted, imagine the nerve of the man, interrupted one of the Federalists and got his name in the published debates of the Ratifying Convention of Pennsylvania. Others aren't quite so grossly biased, and sometimes they're reasonably good. I will exaggerate here for effect, but the Massachusetts, well, the records of the Massachusetts Convention, I think, are reasonably good. They do give the speeches of those who criticized the Constitution as well as those who favored it, but you could tell the politics of the stenographer at one point where he wrote, and again here I exaggerate for effect, he said basically, it was a day like every other day. The Anti-Federalists made their usual silly objections to the Constitution. The Federalists answered them. I can't take down all nonsense. And you start to wonder, with a neutral recorder like that, how much you can believe what he did take down. On the other hand, I would say, David Robertson did a heroic job of taking down what turned out to be a 600-page record of the Virginia Ratifying Convention, which was a spectacular event. And I thought he did a tremendous job, considering the circumstances in which he had to, poor man, sit up in the galleries or balconies. And it was stifling weather, so people were shuffling in and out. It must have been sweltering up in the, up near the rafters. And I don't know, I've never been in Richmond in the summer. I guess it's not fun, right? Okay. They're shuffling in and out. They think they're going to die of suffocation. There's poor David Robertson trying to hear speeches down on the floor that were made without voice, of course. I am more inclined to celebrate his achievement than to stress the shortcomings of his work. In the end, however, Hudson concluded that the records of the state ratifying conventions were so flawed that it was impossible to derive from them anything about the original understanding of the ratifiers. Now, if that was bad news for originalist jurists, it was equally discouraging for historians who don't like to lean very hard on cracked canes. I can tell you, happily, there has been a documentary revolution over the past 25 years since Hudson wrote, and that's what made my book possible. What I'm speaking of is a spectacular editing project at the University of Wisconsin, the documentary history of the ratification of the Constitution, which I will henceforth refer to as the DHRC, of which 21 volumes had come out before my book went to press, including 14 that were focused on ratification in 8 specific states. They've since come out with another volume on Rhode Island, which is going to be the first of 3 on Rhode Island, which is amazing. I can't wait to see how they got enough material out of Rhode Island, which didn't have the debates recorded, and certainly had only rather short conventions when they were finally forced to have them. How they filled 3 volumes of mystery to me. In any case, what happened how these volumes are put together is that essentially teams of editors go through the archives and they dig out relevant documents and then they transcribe them, arrange them, and publish them in subsidized volumes with introductions and notes that give critical background information and identify the participants. The editors collected a mass of wonderful documents on grassroots politics, but I suspect its greatest and most important contribution concerns the state ratifying conventions. In short, it collates day by day a variety of documents on the convention debates, the published debates where they exist, the bare bones official records which just tell you motions made, who was chosen to this committee, et cetera, and rarely say anything about speech, the content of speeches. Also, journals kept by delegates and other attendees, newspaper articles, and private correspondence explaining what was going on, both in and outside the convention halls. Many of those sources don't even exist for the federal convention because it was secret. Together, that array of documents frees historians from depending on a single flawed source and allows them to piece together the story of what happened on the floors of the state ratifying conventions and even in the boarding houses and back rooms where delegates were courted and deals were cut. Not, to be sure, with 100% confidence, but close enough. The ratifying conventions together, those occasional instances where I will read you can read two accounts of a single days of debates and you say, could these guys have been in the same room? They decline in significance. There's a whole story. The big story comes through. The surviving record for various states differs dramatically in size. Delaware, New Jersey, Connecticut, and Georgia fits in one volume. There's not an awful lot of records there. Pennsylvania got a single volume to itself, Virginia 3, Massachusetts 4, New York an astounding 5. And that helped me solve a problem. How to define a clear storyline for an event that happened in 13 places, sometimes simultaneously. I decided to describe in detail Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Virginia, and New York, all of which were key states in the unfolding story of ratification, and all of whose conventions were both distinctive and well documented. Then I would fold the other states into the narrative at appropriate chronological points, and often there wasn't an awful lot to say about some of those states. For the 5 states the DHRC has yet to cover, I relied more than usual on secondary sources, some of which turned out to be magnificent. And I also depended on a surprising number of documents that turned out to have been published in the 19th century or at the time of the constitutional bicentennial. I also got a lot of help from my friends. Jerry Daniel, who is now an emeritus professor at Dartmouth, knows the ratification story in New Hampshire town by town and sometimes house by house. He will tell you why this guy hated that guy and how it affected the way the town turned on ratification. He'll find a little Federalist town tucked away in the middle of New Hampshire and say, why? And then he figures it out. I mean, it's brilliant stuff. Painstaking. I knew him in graduate school. He's now, of course, emeritus at Dartmouth. But, he's just on the cusp of would he do email or not? So I thought I'd give it a shot. Turns out he did do email. I said, Jerry, you remember me? All I wanted to ask him was, basically I had found there was a folder at the New Hampshire State Archives. And I didn't know if it was sort of pro forma delegate credentials or if it said something about what the returns were within the towns. And I knew from Massachusetts town returns would just be wonderfully interesting. And I really wanted to, he's the only one I could think of who I knew for sure would have read this folder. The archivist wasn't very helpful. He tried to be helpful, but he hadn't a clue what he was looking for. So all I was really asking him was, Jerry, is it worth the drive to Concord? He said, He said, I'm going out of town. As soon as I come back, I'll send you some stuff. Don't worry, it'll answer all your questions. And he sent me off-prints of articles, some of which I knew, but some of which I had never thought to look for. And this was a magnificent treasure trove for me. He was one, he counseled me, he read what I wrote, and he said he wanted to do this because he wanted his specialized research read into the general story, as if I was doing him a favor, but I knew it was the other way around. And others were just as helpful. Nobody refused when I asked them to read chapters on states whose histories they knew more thoroughly than I did. And a retired editor at the DHRC, Rich Leffler, volunteered to read the entire manuscript. Mine would be the first big book based on the DHRC, he said, and he thought it was important that it be as accurate as possible. So, my name is on the title page, but the book is, honest, I have to say, it's built on the work of many others, of historians who worked on individual states, and above all, that of the dedicated learned editors of the documentary history. I was, in fact, humbled by the support I received and feel profoundly grateful to be part of a profession that can be so generous and cooperative. Okay, but in the end, what is it? The test is in how it tastes. The big historical question is, so what? So what? Is the story of ratification in my book not just more detailed, but different from the story historians have told before? The answer, I think, is yes. Perhaps the most fundamental example is in the terms with which the story is usually told, as a battle between Federalists and anti-Federalists. As I worked on the book, I was using these terms too, but gradually I became conscious that the only sources using the word anti-Federalist were written by Federalists. And not only was it a Federalist with some rather nasty baggage. Federalists said the anti-Federalists were knee-jerk opponents of federal power who had fought every effort to strengthen the central government since long before the Federal Convention met. They also described anti-Federalists as state politicians worried about their jobs or persons who thought their private interest would be hurt by the Constitution. Those charges did not check out. They do, however, explain why William Findley, a leading critic of the Constitution in Pennsylvania, said he considered the word anti-Federalist a term of reproach, and added that he always treated the appellation with contempt. I felt increasingly uncomfortable calling dead people by a name they considered for good reason a term of opprobrium, and we don't do that with living minorities. Why should we do it with dead people? Don't they deserve a little respect? And I also feared that if I were going to tell the story using Federalist terms, the story would tilt in their direction. So eventually I decided I would use the word anti-Federalist only if it appeared in quotations or if the person so designated accepted it, which occurred, as it turned out, only in the upper Hudson Valley of New York. And there, the Albany Anti-Federalist Committee basically cleared the term of all of its associations. They said, oh, in the beginning of parties, they take on names. They don't mean anything. So if that were the case, it was sort of like, call them the Red Sox or, the Giants. I mean, it doesn't have any political content, right? So they anti-Federalist is as good as any other term. That was fine with them. But avoiding talking about Federalists and anti-Federalists, or Federalists, or seeing it as a contest of Federalists and anti-Federalists, avoided some other misconceptions. I think to talk about the contest of one between Federalists and anti-Federalists automatically suggests, at least to modern people, that there were national parties, which there were not, although the divisions over the Constitution sometimes coincided with state parties. And that in the way of dichotomies, one of those parties was for the Constitution and the other was against. And that, too, I discovered, was incorrect. Thanks to the Federal Convention's insistence that the states had to ratify or reject the Constitution, the final votes in state conventions were yay or nay. The strains of opinion that fed into that artificially simple division were, however, much more complicated. Start with the Federalists. None of them thought the Constitution was perfect. If you doubt that, read the last few days of the Federal Conventions and Madison's notes. One after another says, Hamilton, this is the furthest from what I think we have to do. Gouverneur Morris says, yeah, I don't like it much either. And Franklin says, well, I have reservations. I mean, you know, you wouldn't call them enthusiastic. At most, they said it was the best they could get under current political circumstances. They all agreed that they would work for ratification of the Constitution without any changes before it went into effect. But beyond that consensus, they differed, sometimes dramatically, among themselves. Some wanted a far more centralized system. Late 1787, when the convention was over, Hamilton still dreamed of a future in which the federal government would, and these are his words, triumph altogether over the state governments and reduce them to an entire subordination, dividing the large states into smaller districts. Other Federalists were content, indeed happy, to leave the states in charge of their internal affairs. You won't find a Virginian that would differ on that. And sometimes they favored amendments not so different from those proposed by the Constitution's critics. They insisted, however, that any amendments should be enacted only after the Constitution was ratified, using the provisions in Article 5. Divisions among critics of the Constitution were even more pronounced. Some still wanted to do what the convention was supposed to do, strengthen the Confederation. Power should be granted incrementally, they said, not all at once, as was done by Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, and for a very good reason. Power, they said, is easier to give than to take back. However sensible that position might seem, it wasn't at all practical. Amendments to the Articles of Confederation required unanimous consent of the states, and that was pretty much impossible to get. Rhode Island, after all, hadn't even bothered to send delegates to the Federal Convention. A second and far more numerous group of contenders saw the Constitution as a possible solution to the country's needs if certain ambiguous and dangerous provisions were amended before it went into effect. And I defy any of you to read the Constitution and to tell me that there are not phrases which are ambiguous or questionable. The most prominent changes they wanted would guard against military rule, better secure the people's right of representation, and modify the comprehensive taxing powers the Constitution gives Congress. Those amendments recalled issues that had been central to Americans' fight with Britain, in which the colonists insisted that no taxes could be levied except by representatives who had been chosen by and knew the circumstances of their constituents, and that no free people could be ruled by standing armies. Given the critical importance of those amendments, they had to be read into the Constitution before it was ratified. As Patrick Henry said, only a madman signs a contract assuming he will be able to change objectionable provisions later. Now, there are four groupings, two different kinds of Federalists, two different kinds of critics of the Constitution, as I call them. They correspond with contemporary descriptions of divisions over the Constitution. For one, by the Federal Farmer, a prominent essay writer, in late 1787. They also track well with James Madison's description of divisions in Virginia politics about the same time, except that Madison saw no differences among those who were for, as he said, adopting the Constitution without attempting amendments. But affiliations tended to shift. In short, several contenders who wanted to strengthen the Constitution understood after a while they didn't have a chance of an ice cube in hell, and they joined the proponents of prior amendments. But that position also faced practical problems, particularly after the first 5 states ratified the Constitution without asking for any amendments. Now, if later conventions insisted on amendments, would those 5 states have to convene their conventions again to consider those amendments? And it got worse after June 1788, when New Hampshire became the 9th state to ratify. Thereafter, the demand for prior amendments became impossible. How could a state demand amendments prior to a ratification of the Constitution that had already happened? And as those considerations emerged, a small but critical body of delegates who wanted amendments to the Constitution prior to its ratification made their peace with a compromise developed in Massachusetts to ratify unconditionally while recommending amendments for enactment after the new government began. That shift made the Constitution's ratification possible in several close states. And moreover, miraculous, once a convention voted to ratify, something else strange happened. There were some Federalists, notably in Virginia and Maryland, who voted to recommend amendments that their colleagues disdained. So there's a little movement between these positions, but what we come out saying, the critical division was between those, and if this is true, if the critical division was between those who wanted amendments prior to ratification and those who insisted on considering amendments only after the Constitution went into effect, the likelihood, I propose, of finding profound socioeconomic or intellectual differences between them seems less promising than if it were between those who were for the Constitution or against it. There was, however, one correlation that is worth talking about. Coastal areas and commercial centers inland were almost uniformly in favor of ratifying the Constitution as written. Enthusiasm for it pulled in everyone in those communities, from elite merchants and lawyers through artisans and dock workers, thus cutting across class lines. I believe that they foresaw correctly the ratification and the institution of a strong new national government would bring a major revival of American commerce. Those who opposed ratification of the unamended Constitution tended to come from inland areas where the prospect of a new commercial prosperity was less exciting. And that, I think, allowed them to see problems with the Constitution that others overlooked. Their sensitivity on representation and taxation also reflected the fact that state taxes had multiplied in the 1780s as state legislatures tried to retire their revolutionary debts with an ill-advised rapidity. Those state taxes generally took the form of regressive poll taxes and regressively assessed property taxes that weighed most heavily on the rural population. People already pushed to desperation were understandably concerned over the prospect of more such taxes being levied by a distant Congress insufficiently aware of the people's circumstances. But the East-West divide was never absolute. Here and there, inland communities and their convention delegates were ready to vote for ratification of the Constitution, even without prior changes. So this distinction, I think, is a tendency, and I am not convinced how much predictive quality it would have. Could the process have gone in another direction? Oh, yes. Suppose the first state conventions to meet had been in Rhode Island, North Carolina, New York, and in Virginia, where a substantial part of the population had powerful reservations on the Constitution. Had those states voted no, they would have needed only one more state to make the whole process impossible. And of course, the constraints on subsequent conventions would have been very different. Moreover, although the United States could probably have survived without Rhode Island, send the army in, divided between Connecticut and Massachusetts, what if New York, Virginia, and North Carolina had also refused to ratify. Remember, at the time, North Carolina and Virginia extended from the Atlantic to the Mississippi and included what are now the states of West Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Could so segmented a nation have survived, much less thrived? One more thing. It's something of a truism in the historical literature that the anti-federalists are responsible for the Bill of Rights, which is Woody Holton argues persuasively on unruly Americans. I'm not saying all of unruly Americans I agree with, but he argues this point very persuasively. It's the most popular part of the Constitution today. But of the 5 states that ratified the Constitution while recommending amendments, only Virginia formally asked that a Bill of Rights be added to the Constitution. And those Virginians most enthusiastic about a Bill of Rights, such as Richard Henry Lee and by then Governor Patrick Henry, were bitterly disappointed with the 12 amendments Congress proposed in September 1789. Moreover, nobody, not Washington, not Jefferson, not Madison, not anybody else at the time, so far as I can see, referred to either the 12 amendments proposed by Congress or the 10 ratified by the end of 1791 as a Bill of Rights. Nor, it seems, did any justice of the Supreme Court until after the 14th Amendment was enacted in 1868. When did the term Bill of Rights become commonplace? When did the Bill of Rights join the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution as fundamental documents of the country? There, I will say, ratification raises questions for future work, questions it doesn't answer. In the end, though, I would say the most important contribution of my book is in the story it tells, and I am inclined to say that a good story is its own justification. From the opening round in Pennsylvania, where the Constitution supporters almost blew it by pushing too hard, through the game-saving strategy of Massachusetts, the heart-stopping decision of New Hampshire's ratification convention to adjourn without voting just when it looked like the fight was over, Patrick Henry's game-stealing performance at the Virginia Convention here in Richmond, the cliffhanger New York Convention in Poughkeepsie, and North Carolina's stubborn no, even after the unamended Constitution had more than the 9 state votes required for it to go into effect. The story of the Constitution's ratification is filled with tension and unanticipated twists. It also includes many dramatic moments. My editor's favorite was when John Hancock was carried into the Massachusetts state ratifying convention, wrapped, the sources say, in flannel. Hancock was a very popular governor. He had done more than anyone else to reach out to heal the state's divisions after Shays' Rebellion. He had been elected one of Boston's delegates to the convention, which promptly chose him its president, even though he wasn't there. He was home suffering from an attack of gout, that good old 18th century disease. Convenient, some said. His disease was political, and he'd recover fast enough if it became clear how the convention was going to vote. Instead, the Federalists cut a deal with him, and he made his appearance in that showman-like way. Another dramatic juncture came when the Massachusetts Convention cast its vote. The place it met, a church in Boston on Long Lane, now Federal Street, was packed to the gills. The galleries or balconies, even what was called the cellar, which turns out not to be the basement, but I guess a mezzanine. And indeed, every possible space was stuffed with people. Nonetheless, the hall fell totally silent. Witnesses say you could have heard a coin drop as the vote was taken. Tension was high. Nobody knew the outcome for sure. The only sound was the clerk calling out 364 names one by one, and the delegates answer, yay or nay. In the end, Massachusetts ratified, 187 to 168 with 9 delegates absent, a margin of only 19 votes. Then all over Federalist Boston, bells began to ring. I only recorded that scene as it appeared in the sources, and I think I forgot it after I wrote it. But I went back, and I will say every time I reread what I wrote, I am deeply moved by the contrast between the silence of the hall and the tolling of the bells. I guess I shouldn't call it tolling. Tolling is what someone's dead. This is a joyful ringing of bells. I also have to mention a story. I suspect you people know that moment in the Virginia Ratifying Convention when Patrick Henry, in a high point of what was an amazing rhetorical performance, called on those beings in their ethereal mansions above who were looking down on the Americans. Apparently that's what people do in heaven. Looking down on the Americans, deciding their own fate and the happiness or misery of mankind, when all of a sudden a violent storm shook the hall. The beings of a high order above were screaming out to support Henry's thunder. Truth can be stranger than fiction. And then there were the characters. Some you may have heard of. James Wilson of Pennsylvania, a brilliant if arrogant lawyer who became a Supreme Court Associate Justice. But what about his formidable opponent, the self-educated Irish immigrant William Findlay? The young Massachusetts lawyer William Symes, who dared to be his old law teacher, the forbidding Theophilus Parson, and won. Francis Dana, the first American minister to Russia, and a frail man whose oratory nonetheless left the throngs crowding into the convention in Boston, and even some reporters absolutely spellbound. The reporters were so mesmerized that they forgot to take notes. Jonathan Smith, a farmer from the western part of that state whose heartfelt endorsement of the Constitution, based on his terrifying experiences during Shays' Rebellion, came at exactly the right moment. Or Zach Austin, whom one observer called the best speaker at the Virginia Convention. Better, it seems, than even Patrick Henry or James Madison. And Jefferson said Henry was the greatest orator who ever lived. Powerful praise from Jefferson, who profoundly hated Patrick Henry. I was personally awed by James Iredell's probing analysis of the Constitution, North Carolina's first convention. I never heard of James Iredell or of his wonderfully sprightly, unpredictable analyses. And I also thought his leading opponent, Judge Samuel Spence, was uncommonly good. Above all, there was Melancton Smith, a short man with a thick neck and unruly hair. Without his efforts, the New York Convention would probably not have voted to ratify. And his friend and fellow Congressman, Nathan Dane of Massachusetts, who sent Smith some of the wisest, most statesmanlike political counsel I encountered in all of my research. That there were so many such men is, I think, significant. It shows that the country was not dependent on a handful of great men. The United States had a deep bench. That's not to say Washington wasn't indispensable, or Hamilton wasn't brilliant, or Madison wasn't learned. In the end, however, there were others who might have moved forward into national office, and sometimes did, but who more often spent their political lives within their states. They and their constituents, and those constituents are an important part of the story, invested their minds and their hearts in evaluating the Constitution and its probable impact on what they repeatedly called millions yet unborn. That in the end they supported ratification is only part of their contributions to their country. As I say in the book, they made the Republic work. It was very satisfying to be able to give them finally the place in American history that they had earned so long ago. It felt like an act of justice long overdue. It was also satisfying to tell the missing half of our country's founding story. We have had the elite part, the story of those 55 demigods, as Jefferson called them, who wrote the Constitution. And I am by no means inclined to disparage their achievement or to suggest that Madison's notes and the debates of the Federal Convention are anything but absolutely fascinating. Now, however, we also have the Democratic part of the story, the part that tells how an energized people who knew their power, took their responsibility seriously, and refused to think that the issues of the day beyond their competence shaped the future of their nation. They were also able to move beyond their differences and come to an agreement for the good of the country. That brings the story of the founding down to earth and gives us a model of patriotic politics at its best, committed, conscientious, and in the end, wonder of wonders, constructive. And that, I think, is why we should care. Thank you. Yeah, questions? Now for the fun. Yes?
I thought that your book was marvelously told and wonderful in its impartiality, but I did detect that you were somewhat critical about the way that the Federalists approached the all or nothing decision. And so I did wonder, in the best of all possible ways, how should the ratification process have gone?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. And I am very suspicious of that. I mean, I guess I kind of like, George Mason, he was crotchety. And no doubt he was a crotchety guy, but he had good reason to be crotchety. He was often right. I think there was something questionable about the convention just telling the people take it or leave it. Now, others, Jack Rakoff at Stanford says that it was a brilliant strategy. They never would have worked this out. However, I'm not so sure. The precedent for the ratification of the Constitution was actually the ratification of the Massachusetts Constitution. The Massachusetts Constitution does have the same enacting, we the people of Massachusetts do ordain, or in that case, ratify the Declaration of Rights and a frame of government. But when, in Massachusetts, the people insisted there be a special elected convention to write this, and then they submit it back to the people in the towns. But what the convention did when it sent it out to the towns was to say, read this very carefully. And in fact, they said, you, the people of Massachusetts, have an obligation to read this carefully and go through it, part by part. First of all, tell us how many people are at the meeting. And if any part of it doesn't get the requisite support, and I think they needed a 2/3 vote in order to ratify, explain carefully what people objected to. And the idea was that there would then be another meeting of the convention. It would look over the town returns and they'd say, oh, look, this provision didn't get its necessary support. We have to change it. And then they would alter it so that they could fold in the people who objected to it. In other words, to meet the objections. Well, this was a brilliant idea, and certainly the idea was clear that a constitution has to be fitted to the demands of the people who are going to be governed. But it didn't work. When the convention met, the towns that didn't answer the questions, and they looked at them and they thought, oh my God, this is a terrible mess. And years later, actually, I think 1917, Samuel Eliot Morison went back over these returns and tried to figure it out. And he said, there are a couple parts that he didn't think had really, passed. But all the convention did is what I call in the book, read these returns creatively and say, it's all ratified. Now, but could they have done better? Now, I don't know if that particular procedure could be done, but why didn't they allow the states to propose amendments? In the end, they recommended them. Maybe if they made them sine qua non, You would have had all kinds of different demands that were not reconcilable. But it seems to me some procedure could have been worked out by which the Constitution could have been tailored to what was very clear. Parts that had substantial opposition in the country out there. Of course, that leads to another question. What if it had gone down? The Federalists all said, oh, there's going to be blood in the streets, we'll have civil war. I think that's crazy. I think that you think so too. There would have been another convention, and I think we probably would have got a constitution that we would recognize. I mean, very close to the one that we got, but it would have been changed in certain very critical regards. It wouldn't have said there will be no more than one member of the House of Representatives for every 30,000 people. I mean, you get your head around that. Maybe you're more mathematical than I am. Although I teach at MIT, I'm not an engineer. But it means you can make it worse but not better. Yeah. I mean, and what the people said is, why doesn't it say there shall be one representative for every 30,000 people till the size of the House of Representatives gets to be whatever size you think makes it unworkable. And then they will, recalibrate. They would have figured that one out. They didn't like Article 1, Section 4, and nobody remembers what that is, but it says Congress can lay aside state provisions on elections. They said that could be seriously abused. I think the most important change probably would have been limitations on federal military power. Several states didn't want an army raised unless there was a 2/3 or maybe a 3/4 vote in both houses of the Congress. That would have been harder to get. They really did not like what I call wall-to-wall taxing power. There is no form of taxation denied to Congress. Well, they said, how are the states going to live? Well, they say concurrent rights. Well, they shouldn't say that. I think that probably there would have been greater support for representation, weaker military powers, and somewhat compromised taxing powers, at least with regard to direct taxes. How much difference would it